Okay, so who am I? I work at Signal Sciences. I also help with DevOps Days Austin. I work at lynda.com, and I'm an author on stuff over on the DevOps fundamental stuff over there. And I'm recovering from a lot of years of operations work and security work and all that stuff. And I wanted to start up front with a summary. So if you're like, after these next 3 slides, if you decide like this isn't really the talk I thought I'd want to go to, you're free to leave, right? So hopefully you'll stay. But I think that the path that we're going to try to talk about here is security is still making the journey from DevOps. It's not over. This is still undergoing process. Security sees new opportunities to automate and add value. I think the delivery pipeline, we usually think of it kind of a small, like we think of it as Jenkins or Travis or whatever, but like we need to think about the pipeline in a wider breadth. And I think culture and tooling need to align to help us make this work. And coverage for security needs to happen mainly in 3 areas: where you inherit stuff, where you build stuff, and you have your runtime. And I have some advice on the side of like how to deal with auditors and other people that are blockers inside of your organization as you're moving forward. So I'd like to start with CICD Journey and how, like, as you're thinking about going with continuous delivery, I wanted to give you a little story of like how I went through that. How I went through that process. So I've done this at 3 different companies, and currently I'm at Signal Sciences, and now we do about 15 deploys a day. We're moving fast. We're always kind of enabling our team to kind of go quickly. Roughly, we've done about 10,000 deploys in the last 2.5 years, kind of development, and we sort of we're getting things started, and maybe more than that, but we kind of like lost track of the early days. We're not exactly sure. And early on, I was tasked at work. It was like, hey, we're going to build this thing that like allows us to deploy and help push this out, and it's going to be you, and you're going to demo it in a couple weeks. And I was like, oh, sweet, like that's great. And so I, said a prayer, and I read the Continuous Delivery book by Jez Humble, and was like, all right, I'm going to make this happen, and we're going to try to make that happen. So I really, both Jez and Dave are really great, and really appreciate their work that they did on that book. It's totally worth checking out. And one of the things that really was helpful for me to think about in this is like continuous delivery is how little you can deploy at a single point. Right? It's like I want to deploy just like a 1-line change and be able to walk that through the whole pipeline in as little of time as possible. And we started talking about words like we want to optimize for total cycle time. That's the time that something goes in when you push it into your GitHub or your version control system, and it actually rolls out into production. So time to push to time customers are using it. And so at first we were like 5 minutes or 7 minutes, and now I think we get it down to like, let's see, what is it? Like probably like 2 minutes or so on average, depending on like if you change certain bits, like it invokes other tests sometimes, and that'll be a 3 or 4 minute deploy. And then we built a button, right? We said, let's build this thing so anybody in the organization can go in, and once you commit code, you deploy it, and kind of off it goes. And so we're also a security company, and we're a software as a service security company, and we wanted to make sure that continuous delivery and all that stuff included security. Like this couldn't just be something that we just did and didn't kind of fit with our overall story. Before I was at Signal Sciences, I also found this idea of rugged software circa like 2010, and there's this lovely presentation by Josh Corman, David Rice, and Jeff Williams. And in it, they started talking about things that gave us new ideas of what security really could be. And so I think I pulled this out of some slides that I did in like 2012. It was like security, like it's always, there's a lot of problems with security. You're kind of judged on like absence of events. So like success is not really well known. It's high cost. It's often negative in a lot of organizations. It had a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And really, it's like a toxic word. Like you want to go into an organization and like not get promotions and not do well. It's like be like, I'm the security person. They're like, okay, go over there, right? And anybody, has that ever happened to a friend? Yeah, right. So But rugged, it was like this idea, and like some of the people in the security industry that had been there for a long time started thinking like, well, what if we started talking about this is a quality problem, and we want to start verifying like we're providing the right qualities, that we start adding benefits to the organization, stuff that's affirming, stuff that's positive, and we're putting like known quantities on things. And there was a while there was like we should have the software should ship with like the serial box label to tell you like, what stuff is included in this and all the dependencies that are built into it. But at the time, we were really trying to wrestle with the idea of what does this look like to do things in a different way than the way we did before. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I started the Gauntlet Project, which I'll talk about more later. But that is a way for us to help kind of take security and DevOps and kind of merge those together in a way that groups can collaborate. And I found over time, like security is different in a continuous integration world. And security has a dilemma. And that dilemma is that it doesn't really know what it's doing, doesn't really know how well it's doing. And I think that in security, we always kind of came up with this idea. Like, we have this binary bifurcation of how we think about security. So it was always, are we breached? Or are we unbreached? Are we secure or unsecure? And like we didn't really, it was just a 1-0 type relationship there. And I don't know, like it's not good. It's actually not true as state of reality. It's actually an over-reductionism of what we're trying to do. And I think that we would take these complex systems and just try to say like, got a lot of firewalls and like everything's blocked, and so like therefore now we're okay. But I think that when we start kind of moving away from that question of whether we're breached or whether we're secure, and we start thinking of how does security add value, I think we're left with a different approach. We're left with a different way of thinking, and I think that's going to be more in line with the kind of the future as security is growing. So I'll quickly summarize how I think that we got to this state. So Agile came on the scene, and everyone was really excited, and it tried to remove the ability of not knowing what we're doing and how we're getting there. It just said we're going to ship it, right? And it largely worked in a large number of ways, but really it just created a culture that gave us fast delivery, fast feedback loops, but it never really. Sorry, I got these slides out of order. This is my funny slide. So those are about as funny as they're gonna get. I gotta just warn you. I know it's the afternoon. All right, so, but we didn't really get Agile all the way into operations. And it sort of stopped there. And I think that was whenever we started to see the next rise, right? And that's when DevOps came on the scene. There's a continuation of Agile to operations. In Tom Limoncelli's book, he says the same thing. DevOps is the application of Agile methodology to system administration. And then, let's see, in 2009, there was the famous we do 10 deploys a day over at Flickr presentation of Velocity. And this is a big system operations conference, and everybody there just sort of lost it. They're like, you do deploys once a quarter, if you're lucky, maybe once a month if you're like, a real cowboy or something. But you're not doing 10 deploys a day. That's ridiculous. And it was at that conference and a couple other things that happened around that time period when DevOps really started to take off. Patrick Dubois had the first DevOps days. He coined the term and had the event here, not too far away here in Ghent. And early days, we were really good at Photoshop in the DevOps community, so we were like, we just sort of wanted to illustrate our problem, right? It's development and operations, two incompatible things, because we kind of had this wall between us, and so we're really spending a lot of time tearing down the wall. And if you go to DevOps Days events, there's a lot of cultural talks because in a lot of organizations, this is still existing, or still kind of in the process of going through that. And we always encapsulated it with this presentation or this graphic, and it was just like it's sort of this picture embodies kind of all of DevOps. I had to train some sales guys recently, and I said, this. here's two graphics. I just showed them this graphic and the previous graphic, and I was like, that's DevOps, and they're like, yeah, we got it. Like, that's it, right? They're like that. They got the emotion aspect, and that's why we really spent a lot of time in the cultural pieces of DevOps early on. We also found in a lot of organizations, you saw like a 10-to-1 ratio of developers to operations folks. Like, so it's a complete order. You know, it's roughly different for different organizations, different teams, different things that you're doing, but it's an order of magnitude problem that we just weren't able to solve right away. Patrick Dubois, he says, culture is the most important aspect to DevOps and for it to succeed in the enterprise. And I think it was like in 2011 or 2012, there's the Qatar IT Journal, and there was because it was early days, and it was like, can you do DevOps in the enterprise? And I was on one of the teams that was featured in that. One of my coworkers, Ernest Muller, and a good friend. But our team had just kind of at the right time, like we'd gone cloud in 2010 with kind of a charter, and we also said, hey, we're going to be doing this thing called DevOps, and everybody was like, sure, we don't care, let's just do it. And then we started to see like how this was able to affect a lot of changes in the enterprise, and that was a really, really fun time. But it really drove me to think about culture. Like, how are we changing our culture? And I think there's 4 keys that I would leave you to culture, and I'm not an expert on this, I'm not a psychologist or any of that stuff, but I've always seen like you start kind of building a mutual understanding, you build shared language, shared views about how things work, and then you put tooling in place that helps encourage all that collaboration in those previous things. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and when she was 3 or so, and her room is positioned so like right when you look out the windows, you can see the moon as it's setting. And so every time, not all the time, but whenever there's like the right time of year and everything, and time of night when she's going to bed, and we'd see it, and we'd look at the moon, and we'd talk about the moon, and we started having like these same values and the same understanding. And then I started to figure out, like a couple days later, I got excited. Like I would come home and I would tell my wife, I was like, oh, we're gonna see the moon because like the moon is out tonight. And then I started installing apps, like moon tracking apps and like weather apps, and like trying to know like what phase is the moon in. So like now I could tell my 3-year-old daughter and impress her with like moon phase. It's ridiculous, right? But like all that stuff started to change, right? Like a new thing happened for me, like a new priority happened, and I thought that was, to me, I think that kind of illustrates those four key aspects. But all this, we're kind of here, how we got here. Where was security in all this? Has security just been sitting by? And I really think they have. They haven't really participated in this, and they're just now sort of making the change. Part of the problem is like security has always come from a compliance-driven aspect. It's been inevitable in our industry, but that was the way that we kind of spent the last 10, 15 years. There's this really great book. It's about browser security, but the first chapter in the book, he goes and talks about this history of security all the way from like the 60s to like the modern day web browser and where we sit. And I'd like to read this quote for you. He's talking about risk assessment, but doing security by risk assessment introduces a dangerous fallacy that structured inadequacy is almost as good as adequacy, and that underfunded security efforts plus risk management are about as good as properly funded security work. And does that bother anybody in here? Like, does that leave you feeling uneasy? Yeah, it made me upset, right? I'm like, what the heck? Like, why would we somehow believe that we could have this, that we could just have bad workmanship, bad quality, and just say, oh, because we put enough structure around it, we put enough legal policies around it, we bought enough insurance around it, then now we're good. Like, that makes no sense. You wouldn't do that in the real world. Why do we do this with software, and why is that an idea? And also, we saw in organizations, there's another problem. Like, it's not just 10 to 1, it's like 100 to 1, or 300 to 1, or 300 to half. Like it doesn't matter what the actual numbers are, but like everybody I've asked, like these are order of magnitude type problems. And security doesn't have the resources. And one of the hidden secrets about security is like there's not enough people in the industry to solve this problem. Like if you said tomorrow we're gonna like 3x our security teams, like you couldn't do it. There's not enough bodies to do that in the industry. And you see security people hop jobs every 18 months because it's like recruiters keep calling them and they keep doing it. It's just like development, but maybe even like hotter right now. Like it's crazy. And also security, because of all that other stuff, because they've been addicted to compliance and kind of been been sitting in the organization that way because there's the large delta between how many people they're working on. Security is the cultural outlier in a lot of organizations, and they don't really want the same thing. I had a friend, so I've always kind of been the security guy on the team, and one of my friends, and he was actually like my manager at the time, was like, well, security, you guys just prefer to have a system that are powered off and unplugged. And I was like, well, okay, I guess, but like that sort of hurts my feelings. You think I'm like, I know that if we do that, like I have no job. Like, I'm not an idiot, right? And then, I try not to do this because I've lived the pain on the other side. But how many security people have ever said like those stupid developers, right? Has anybody heard security people say that? Has a friend would have said that, right? It happens, and it doesn't feel good. But I think this illustrates the divide between the two. Also, I found this lovely gem in a white paper from these people that are doing web app firewalls, and I'll just like to read this to you. It says, every aspect of managing web app firewalls is an ongoing process. That's the antithesis of a set it and forget it technology. That's the real point of this research. It's to maximize value from your web app firewall. You need to go in with everyone's eyes open to the effort required to get and keep the WAF running productively. So, and they go on to tell you, like, you need 2 or 3 headcount to do this, right? A very questionable technology that's for any effect. And we don't have enough people in the industry anyways. And now you're saying, like, now my new business is running this piece of junky technology, right? And I don't mention the name because I don't want to make fun of them publicly. But security's always taken that same approach. Like, they put a heavy constraint on resources. It's a big bottleneck approach. There is an article, I guess, last year in Fortune magazine. The average time to deliver for corporate projects has gotten worse. It's increased over the last 5 years, which, as a DevOps person, like, makes you really sad. Like, I'm like, why is that? And then the next thing, he says, well, the growth of security functions, which is too poorly coordinated and resulting in a proliferation of new tasks in the areas of compliance, privacy, and data protection is the main reason and the main culprit for that. And so, okay, so now we see that security is causing a real problem. Okay, this is an interesting one. It is 30 times cheaper to fix security defects in prod or in dev versus prod. Newsflash, 2002, right? And so this came in my mail in a flyer from a security company within like the last year. Like, it was like, hey, we have news. Like, it's more expensive. I'm like, you got to be kidding me, right? But security is feeling the same pressure, like they're behind as well. All right, so that might have been the funniest one. So I'm a little worried for your sake for the rest of the slides, because that was my best one. Okay, well, anyways, security is ineffective. Well, that's pretty funny too. I like that one. All right, Mr. Robot fans. But I think security knows that it needs to change or die, and I think it's true in the industry, and I think we've seen it across the way. Stephen Beloven, he's written the Firewall book that was really huge, and he came out with a book last year, or I guess a year and a half ago. He says, companies are spending a great deal on security, but we read of massive computer-related attacks, and clearly something is wrong. The root of the problem is twofold. We're protecting the wrong things, and we're hurting productivity in the process. So he sees that security is, like, in both ways, like, causing a problem. We're not adding value, and we're protecting the wrong things. Of course, you could just print 1 million of these slides and show, like, that, yeah, security is expensive. The last the State of DevOps report last year, high performers spend 50% less time remediating security issues than low performers. High-performing organizations achieve quality by incorporating security and security teams into the delivery process. And these are some of the findings that came out of this. Rich Mogul, who's big in the security industry, at RSA conference got up and said, in front of a large crowd, and said, a large percent of the companies that are hanging out on the show floor here will not be here in 5 years. And he said, basically everything that we know about the security industry is changing. We see that the writing is on the wall, and all that stuff is happening as we go. A couple years ago, Zane Lackey gave this presentation about how at Etsy they deliver faster, better, cheaper, and I watched that and I thought, that's right on. I was a friend of Zane's, but I also was really excited to see that approach. All right, so let's talk about a CI/CD pipeline and what that looks like. So I think for different people, pipelines are going to look a little bit different, and most people will break it down into some grouping of this, like design, build, operate, or design, build, deploy, operate. I also like to think about inherit as like one of the steps there. And I'm just going to focus on these three spots: inherit, build, and operate. And I'll explain what I mean with that here. And there's other stuff you can do in these pieces. Like you should do all the design pieces. There's other stuff like for in your design, you do like write data flow, threat models, and all that business. But I'm not really an expert in that, so I'm not going to spend time on that. And then on the deploy piece, you should manage your secrets, vault, other stuff like that. Also, not going to talk about that because that's really specific to your language, your framework, and all the stuff that you're using. But I'd like to talk about these three, and these are the three considerations I'd like to propose, and maybe a couple questions that you can think about that might help drive you forward as you're going through here. What have I bundled into my application that leaves me vulnerable? And think about not just the couple packages that you install with your actual app that you've called in there, any dependencies in the app, but think about like what about the OS level? What about the provider that I'm using to deploy it on? The talk on Docker stuff this morning or earlier this afternoon was great because as you think about all the stuff you're bundling in, it's like, do you want to bundle in 128 megs or 5 megs of dependencies, right? And you can start breaking that stuff down. For build, do my build acceptance tests and integration tests catch security issues before release? Like how many people are doing security testing in their build phases? A couple? Yeah, okay, great. But I think there's a lot more that can be done in that phase, and we often just sort of skip by that and say, hey, we'll pick that up later. And then operationally, am I being attacked right now? And if I am, like, is it working? Are they actually getting any successful foothold? The company I work for, we kind of play in this last space a little bit, or we play in this last space. But we ask people all the time, like, do you know if you're being attacked? And like, you just usually blank stares, right? And I won't out any of our customers because that would be bad, but like that's kind of like that's indicative of the industry. That's indicative of what we actually know that's going on with our system. Shannon Leitz gave this talk over at DevOps Days Austin last year, and broke it up into these 4 phases. And I liked it because really ask at each of those phases different questions. And so I borrowed some of my ideas from that, and so just want to make sure she had good coverage there. Okay, security in the delivery pipeline. So inherit. We've already talked about this a little bit today. Okay, OpenSSL, right? All of a sudden it's like, oh, I have a lot of problems. Why? Because I'm using this thing. Or shell shock because I'm using this old version of Bash or whatever. Gareth Rushgrove did a great presentation on what's inside the container and showing how many containers have vulnerabilities in them. There's statistics out there saying like 30% of Docker images out there have vulnerabilities. Right now in Docker Hub, you can actually see the vulnerabilities listed out with different types of containers. If you're using something like Ruby, you should be doing like a bundler audit to check like what gems you have going on there. There's other tools like Linus that do the same thing. If you're doing serverless, there's a thing called SNCC, which does dependency checking for serverless, specifically in Node. There's Docker Bench, which will check for dozens of common best practices and things that you're doing for deploying and dealing with containers in production. Also, Erland, a friend of mine, has this library called RetireJS. It checks if you're using any JavaScript that's like no longer any good. We do this for our sites where we're delivering things, and just you never know. Like whenever something you keep something static website, and then the version of jQuery or whatever you're using is no longer any good because it's got some vulnerabilities. You want to be alerted to that. So putting all that stuff in your build pipeline is really great. Yeah, and I think that's kind of fits. I can't remember if I have any other stuff on this, but you want to instrument your CI system with all the checks for all the things that you inherit. And that's just as much as you possibly can. If you're using containers like Twistlock and Aqua, or look at Sonatype stuff and Black Duck if you have some money, but there's a lot of like free stuff that you can pull in. And depending on your language and all that stuff, you just pull those in. All right, on the build side, security is a function of quality, and I think that when we look across all code languages, this is from a White Hat security report like a couple years back. If you look across, it doesn't matter which language you're in. they all have vulnerabilities. So across the top is like ASP, Cold Fusion, .NET, Java, Perl, PHP. And then on the left-hand side there is cross-site scripting and all like the OWASP top 10 all the way down. And they're just showing like all languages everywhere have problems. And so we can't just say like, oh, I'm using Go, like I'm good now, right? Or I can't just say, oh, we're using, well, I don't know. I don't know. It's like you pick on any one of the languages here. You don't want to do that. So we use Go at work, so I guess I'll pick on that one. But also, another problem with security and the way that you like instrument that inside of a build pipeline is security tools are really noisy. You run them, and if you pick up like just an off-the-shelf scanner and you hook it up to your system that you want to do some testing on, it'll like try to spider it, and then it'll enumerate a bunch of stuff, and then you'll come back like 3 hours later, and it'll either be crashed or it'll like show you something maybe useful, or it'll show you a bunch of stuff that's not really true. And if you've ever has anybody had to deal with security scanners? So I still saw a couple chuckles. So if you've had to deal with those, you kind of know what I'm talking about, right? And then in the end, you're kind of left with this like giant PDF or whatever to deal with. But so I sort of felt that we really needed a new way to collaborate across like developers, operations, and security, and to see what we could do to make that happen. And I was hoping to really make a language that would kind of put some of that collaboration into practice. And so that's why I started working on a project called Gauntlet. Gauntlet is open source. It's MIT license. It comes with a lot of pre-canned steps that'll help you compose in what we call attack files, some statements to go ahead and like be mean to your code, which is our little tagline that we like to use. It doesn't install any tools, but it does sit really nicely inside of your CI/CD pipeline. It's built on top of Cucumber. It's not really meant to be a pure replacement for like a BDD type thing, but it functions in the same way. So it has a good handling of exit status and all that. You can check it out at gauntlet.org, but the general idea in our very slick graphics here is that you would run your code through the Gauntlet. There it is. Did you see it? Do I need to do it again? Okay, yeah. You're going to be like, in your feedback forms, you'll be like, awesome graphics. Like, I'm hoping that will come through. Okay, that's the full jokes. That's all I got. Anyways, I'll just stick to the slides now. So if we look in the directory, we look at the attack files, and it pulls in all those attack files. And you're just getting started by doing like a simple gem install. We also have Docker containers, which I think I have in another slide. But if you read through this, it sort of fits kind of an English language approach here. So given I'm looking for cross-site scripting, and I'm going to do it against a URL on my site, and you can make it more specific. So like on my login page, I'm going to look for this. And then you give it a scenario with some description there. And then you say, given that I have the tooling that I need in place installed, when I launch an attack against this URL, I expect that the output should have 0 issues detected. If not, fail the test and send an alert status out. I was just talking to a friend over at United Healthcare, and he was telling me that he's like, we have saved millions of dollars using Gauntlet for the largest healthcare industry project out there right now in the United States. And I was like, oh man, I should have figured out a way how to get tens of those, you know. But you know, he was really, you know, saying that they were able to start taking all these pieces of their applications across their entire stack. I think there's this project spans like 300 applications, he was saying, and start putting in like default checks. So looking for cross-site scripting, looking for SQL injection. And you can kind of set up some parameters, and like was starting to be able to bake up all these things together. And now you got everybody testing kind of with low bar security threshold there. I did a workshop a couple, let's say, I guess about a year and a half ago with Matt Johansson, and it's at this bit.ly link. So if you're interested in it, it's got 8 labs for how to use Gauntlet. It's got using Gauntlet for doing things like network checks if you want to like do things like that, or if you want to check for application issues like cross-site scripting or SQL injection, or other appses. I don't know what I meant there. Sorry about that. And then handling reporting, so you can report into different formats. You can pump out to JSON or whatever. How to hook it up with environment variables, and importantly, showing you how to do it in a CI system and a CI setup. So there's the bit.ly link, but you can check it out again. It's all using this project inside of our repo, inside of GitHub, just called Gauntlet-Demo. And I'm really sorry for the spelling. Like, when we released the gem originally, like, the gem with an E was taken, so now you got to deal with the smaller hipster Gauntlet with just a T there. And so it's pretty easy to get started. We also have a starter kit that installs a virtual machine and gets you bootstrapped there. And really, we're just trying to help think through like creating feedback loops, right? We want to create a lot of feedback loops from development to operations and security, and that's the hope that Gauntlet would do inside of those teams, because now you're able to take the knowledge-strapped and time resource strapped people in the security, the 1 out of the 110 1, and they're able to implement their kind of knowledge base into the system, and everybody else can reference it. And you don't have to be a security expert to see like, oh, like that test started failing whenever I checked in this new code. Like that's, you may not know what the test actually does, but you can now get to the root of like, okay, now I have cross-site scripting for some reason. Wasn't sure why. Also, Gauntlet Demo is also hooked inside of Travis, so it runs CI builds if you're interested in checking that out, and that's what those look like. A lot of teams are using Gauntlet in containers because you're like, oh, I don't want Ruby on it. So even for our stuff inside of Signal Sciences, we use Gauntlet in a Docker container, and it just spins up, runs all the attacks, and then turns out the results for us. And you can check that out at Gauntlet Docker. Other stuff you might want to check out in this space, Zette Attack Proxy is a really cool project. It lets you do, if you ever use like a web proxy, but it lets you do replay of things, and you're able to do both fuzz testing and just other type of attacks with it as well. If you're doing static code analysis, something like Breakman is a really cool tool. I think that was mentioned a little bit earlier. But that's specifically for Ruby. You can check that out. All right, I think we're in the last bit here. How's everybody doing? We're hanging in? Okay, good. All right, so configuration and runtime. Earlier today we were talking about configuration is one of the biggest problems that we have, and problems that we fix. I didn't show you some of the other slides from that White Hat report, but it's like problems we have today, and then come back a year later, percentage of problems that got fixed, and it's like, yeah, like none. It's like, or how often a bug stays open at a corporation that's medium level or lower. It's like 200 days, 500 days, something crazy, and you would think, well, how's that even possible? Okay, so for configuration, I like Chef Inspec. You can do, but if you're using Chef, like that's useful. If you're using something else, check that out for those. I only know stuff that I know, right? But you can do audit and do CIS benchmarks on machines. Other stuff that you could look at for cloud providers, Evident.io, Threat Stack, Alien Vault. They'll look at your cloud configuration and see like, did anything change in between, and be able to do reporting on that. I know there's other companies in the space, but I have some friends at some of those places, and I think those are pretty good options to at least start taking a look at there. Okay, so for runtime, okay, and that's pretty much my best GIF in the whole thing. Okay, so good. Runtime is arguably the most important place to start, and I think that's the most important place to instrument because you're actually able to see what is actually happening with your application, and it can inform some of the other things downstream. So you want to think about, am I under attack, and where am I under attack? You can get a lot of benefit using like something like mod security and pumping that over to a Logstash, an elk stack, and reporting out of that. Other things you want to look at in this space are like RASP, Next-Gen WAF, or like web protection platforms, which is kind of a marketing mouthful there. But you should also look at other companies. I know that Ruben's company would also fit up here on this list, so you definitely want to give them a check. And the marketing team was going to see this, so I had to say that ours is the best. But really, like you want to be doing RASP, you want to be doing something in this space to see like what is actually under attack, what's going on here. All right, so you want to start figuring out how to detect what matters. So whether that's code instrumentation in the actual app itself or whatever, but you're looking for things like account takeover attempts. What part of the site gets more attacks than others? Most likely of vectors of attack, business logic flaws. I had this really interesting conversation with a friend, and they were saying what they saw in their runtime actually informed how they were going to prioritize their backlog. because they were doing all these bug bounties, and they were saying, okay, $20,000 up for grabs if you hack our site. Anything that came in high or critical, like that got fixed like immediately. If anything came in medium or low, just kind of went into the backlog, and they paid out like $100 or whatever for the bounty, but just never really prioritized it in their environment. And then through adding runtime instrumentation, they were able to say, oh, like our login page gets like these types of attacks, and like, do we have anything with that tag that's in our backlog? Oh yeah, let's prioritize that. Like those are vectors that people are actively going against our site with, and so we want to know that. Oh yeah, that should have. Oh, if you're doing a bug bounty, that's right. Here's a couple of bug bounty sites that are good. These are also commercial, but you can run your own, of course, but these are some that kind of make it easy to hit there. One thing that I found as a problem is a lot of times people will kind of, when you say, I want to do a pipeline, developer's going to push code, and then they say things like, well, you got to have separation of duties. And just like GOTO is considered harmful, we're going to say separation of duties is considered harmful. We're not people launching nuclear missiles, right? You don't need two people to turn a key. You have like your paid staff that are engineers that should be allowed to be trusted with their environment. And you can defend this with, even in PCI, I think it's like PCI 3.6 or I can't remember the exact number, but there is a little line that says like you need to have separation of duties. But if you read the guidance, it just says the same account that's used for development cannot be used to push for production. Right? It doesn't say the same person can't do it or whatever. Like a lot of enterprises and big organizations have interpreted this way. I have a friend who is an auditor, and she's like, "Oh yeah, we've been doing this for like decades," where people would, the same person that developed it, is also pushing it, small teams, and you can take that same law and process and approval control process and like make it work for big teams and she was working at a big company doing the same thing, and kind of that's how they do it. And so you just invest in proving out your pipeline, making sure that the controls are so that development and test and production accounts don't match, and that there has to be some promotion going on. There's a toolkit that's called the DevOps Audit Defense Toolkit. It was kind of a bunch of security and compliance people that said, okay, we want to give people that are doing DevOps and security a way to move forward without being blocked by all the lawyers and accountants and stuff. And so they produced this 20-page PDF, and it kind of goes through different compliance specs, and it breaks it down system by system, control by control, and helps you map to say, yeah, here's how we get over that. And so just a little bit of arguing with your auditor and kind of this document, and you should be square to go. If you're not, I'd love to hear that. Okay, so there's 3 things that I learned kind of on the journey, and I think we're kind of running late on time. 3 lessons I learned. 1, security is not a binary event, so we want to embrace feedback loops and continually innovating there. We also want to think of attack-driven defense instead of compliance-driven defense. No one's going to be adding value just by checking the checkbox of compliance. But if you're able to actually actively know where, like having insight into where you're undergoing attacks, or being able to defend against that, whether in development or in runtime, like that's really beneficial. Also, there's a lot of movement inside. If you're in security or you have a friend in security, you might suggest to them like every time they're a blocker, someone is going to go around them. And in the Riot Games office, they have this big sign that says like, if you are a blocker, if security functions as a blocker, you will be routed around, right? Because people are going to get the work done that they need to get done, whether security says they can or not. So you want to be part of adding value to the chain, putting as much automation in place, but not making those other things. So, all right. So here's the summary that we went through earlier. Hopefully that went good. Like I said, if you want the slides, you can hit that email. It should auto respond to you. And I think that's it. Any questions?